Welcome to From the Pit number 3. I'm Larry Blank, and today's guest is the eminent orchestrator on Broadway and movies and television, Doug Besterman. Hey, Doug, welcome.
Hi, Larry. Thank you. So glad to be here to talk.
Yeah, I feel like we never talk, although we've been talking for the last hour, getting ready for this. um,
Exactly.
Basically, uh, everyone should know that Doug has been orchestrating on Broadway for a number of years now, and is in my estimation the number one man whenever Jonathan Tunick is not available, because Jonathan just does everything
I
he
would
did the
agree.
first time,
Not
and
number
then
one, but I would take Jonathan over me if somebody had a choice. Absolutely, I'd choose Jonathan.
well, as Jonathan says, because he keeps on redoing his earlier work, at least they allow him to shoot his own horse. So,
Yes,
and I know you're getting to the point now where you're getting to reorchestrate some of your old stuff as if it's new again. We've gotten to the point
indeed,
where
indeed.
the orchestras of yore of 26 are now 6 or 10 or 12. But that's a
Right,
whole
if you're
other
lucky. Yeah.
discussion. What I really wanted to talk about today, more than orchestrating and arranging, is about some of the less successful shows that you've done, I've done, and working with different composers, and how we navigate with the orchestras, and how we do it. So
Yes.
can you pick a show and that you enjoyed working on that perhaps was not as successful as it might have been, and how you got there?
Yeah. One comes to mind, and we should probably make a disclaimer that less successful does not mean less good, right? So it was a good show,
Right.
and in fact, this particular show that I'm thinking about continues to have a huge life in licensing. It may be one of the top licensing shows in history. So the authors of the show would probably consider it very much a success. But at the time, it was not successful on Broadway. It had a very short run. It was not critically well received. And the show I'm thinking about is Seussical. How does that sound as one to talk about?
That's a great one. That's a great one.
Okay, good.
And
So this
Seussical ran
was
on Broadway.
so
I
so this
remember the
was
cast.
the yeah Seussical. I don't remember exactly how long it ran. Maybe we can look that up at some point on the Google. But it was in the year 2000. That's when I can't remember. I think it was late summer, fall of 2000, somewhere around there. And we rehearsed in New York and then went to Boston, and that's where we did our out of town tryout. And then it came to New York following Boston fairly quickly, if memory serves. And in fact, what I remember, just in terms of how it stuck in my memory in terms of the timeline, was it was it was in New York. They were making the cast recording right when I was starting the producers, which was 2001. So it was right before we worked on that. And but Seussical was finished already by then. We had finished doing all the work for Broadway. Now maybe I've gotten the dates or the months
No, you
slightly
have got
wrong,
it
but
right. I
that's
just
how it.
looked it up. It says following its Broadway debut in 2000, the show was widely panned by critics and closed in
Right.
2001, but it spawned two national tours and a West End production, and has become a frequent production
Yes.
for schools and regional theaters.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't even
And
remember
it's
who was
it,
the
it, it was
original
really
lead.
it Kevin Chamberlain.
Right.
And
I remember.
well, Kevin Chamberlain was Horton.
Um,
Okay, good. Yeah, I know Janine Lamanna was in it, um, and Sarah Gettelfinger. It was a very good cast. None of these. It's very rare that the problem is with the casting. I mean, on a Broadway level, they spend a lot of time casting, and the cast was great. I mean, it's how the material gets developed, and how the creative team, whether the creative team is all united in a concept or not. And so I can only speak from my perspective and what I remember about a show that was 24 years ago. But my recollection was that there were a lot of different Seussicals on that stage, and and it didn't add up to ultimately, well, first what the authors imagined, and in my opinion, they're the most important people. They wrote the piece, they had a vision for it. So I think it wasn't, certainly Out of Town, it wasn't what they imagined it to be in specific ways. And then I think, um, you know, there's a lot of money spent on these shows, so then producers get involved in terms of the creative aspect of it, and make changes in personnel and ask for writing changes, and things then move in a direction. The train leaves the station, and you got to be on it, and so and things can kind of go awry. Now, I don't remember everything about it, but I do think that when the show closed on Broadway and then reopened on tour, that the authors went back to some earlier versions of things that they had preferred. And that may be, I believe that is the show that you license now, is a version that where they reverted some of the changes they made for Broadway to earlier versions of things, and maybe put back some things or rewrote in a way that they felt they weren't able to on Broadway, or were asked not to. I mean, I wasn't privy to all of those conversations, but it is when you look at, I mean, we can talk, because this is from the pit, we can talk about what it was like musically for us. That I sort of do remember. And when you're doing a show Out of Town, I mean, first of all, just orchestrating a show is a Herculean task, right? I mean, it's just a lot of
Well, the
work.
amount of
And then
pages and the amount of music to handle, yeah.
yeah, in the amount of time. And this was the year 2000, and it was very early on. We didn't have Ableton and pre-records and that sort of thing, but I wanted to integrate some sound effects into the orchestrations. I wanted to use, we could call them sequenced percussion tracks. I had worked with a sound designer, who was in Las Vegas at the time, but he was the musical director for Cirque du Soleil, and we were connected to him by our sound designer Jonathan Deans. And he and we spent a week designing sounds. Like, I made gorilla sounds by beating my own chest and recording it and sampling it, and that became like percussion grooves and things like that. We had some ideas. So it was very early on in terms of integrating that into live performance in the theater. And so, we used whatever techniques were available to us at the time. But so there was that to take care of, as well as the orchestration. So then you get finished, zooming ahead, and you write the last note of the bows or the exit music or whatever, and then the changes start. So that's where it gets really interesting. That's where the story of a musical that wasn't successful on Broadway differs from a show that is successful. Because when it's successful, you make little trims and tighten things up, and you know that sort of thing, and then you clap your hands and you're done. But on a show that isn't going well, the writing continues, and that's
I
really the
kind of
big difference.
remember because we were doing a lot of stuff at that time around, you know, circling around in LA and New York. But I seem to remember that Rosie O'Donnell came in and you had a massive amount of rewriting to do. Maybe I'm remembering that
Well,
wrong, but
yeah, she
there
came
was.
in New York. Yes, no, because that role, the role of the Cat in the Hat, was played by a man, originally. So it was all male presenting, is what we say now in 2024. So
Mhm.
a lower voice register part, and it had to be, everything had to be rethought for a higher voice register part. And it was, it's not just the songs themselves, but it's the transitions, and how, if there are multiple characters singing in a song, it's how those voices relate to each other. And of course, Steve Flaherty worked a lot of that out, but then we had to adjust the orchestrations to suit the new keys. So that was absolutely a lot of work. And I'm sure there was a lot, I don't remember specifically, but I'm sure there was a lot of book work as well to accommodate Rosie O'Donnell and her take on the character and that sort of thing.
Of course, I don't think people realize that there's a lot of stuff that we as orchestrators and have to handle that nobody thinks about, like that. For instance, we're aware of the registers and stuff, and no one will say anything necessarily, but we hear it and have to deal with it, knowing the foibles of the pit and the musicians in the pit. Or I'm sure you've
Yeah,
attended a
absolutely.
performance and you hear something that really is not pleasing to your ear, and without saying much, you go out and fix it. on your own.
Right, in terms of the orchestrations. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's, that's an interesting little side topic, is making adjustments to the orchestration. I mean, so, and you've said this, I've said this, we've covered this before on other podcasts and other conversations. But so an orchestrator is in a service job. So yes, it's very creative, and we bring a lot of creativity to the production and to the equation. We bring all of our skills and our taste and that sort of thing. But ultimately, we have a boss. I mean, that's just the simplest way of saying it. So who's the boss on a particular production is a very important question for anyone to know. Who has the power of yes and no to your work. So
You're talking about the muscle on a show.
yeah,
You know,
okay, so right, sorry, yeah, talking, yeah. Well, who are you trying to please? So that's the first level of revisions that you make. So on a Stephen Flaherty musical, generally speaking, every musical, the first person that I'm dealing with is the composer, or the composer lyricist if they're a team, and so they're going to sit in the orchestra rehearsals with me, and they're going to say, oh, that isn't what I expected. What's going on there? We might look at it and talk about it, and maybe we'll make a little adjustment or a big adjustment, depending on how something strikes them. So you get through those changes, then the sitz probe happens, and the director and choreographer come in. So so you're working for them also, of course. We're all working for them. So then they come in, and a choreographer might say, oh, I imagined there'd be an effect on that leap there. And is it there? I'm not hearing it. And you'll look at it, or maybe there was something I missed, or we all missed, or something they added after I orchestrated it. So then you make those kinds of adjustments based on what the director and or choreographer are hearing. And then you make those changes. And then you might get into the pit, and other changes get requested. Oh, that underscoring is very delicate. Let's maybe think about how that's working, and maybe there's too much or too little, or that moment needs to be bigger or longer. Sometimes in tech they find you need more music, so then you're dealing with that. So when in the process does an orchestrator get to respond to their own work and make changes based on how we're responding to our own work? Well, that's tricky. I mean, I think if you got a group of orchestrators together, we'd all have sort of different feelings about it. My feeling is it's most important to take care of everyone else first. But I try to slip in, if there are things that I'm really unhappy with, I try to slip them in. Now, there's also, I tend to be very conscientious about the budget too. Anytime I ask the copyists to work, they're going to get paid, and so that's part of the, I'm spending the production's money, so I try to be conscientious about that as well. I'm not going to ask for major changes on my own that nobody else has requested, without certainly going to the producers and alerting them that I'm thinking of doing it. And 9 times out of 10, I'm sure they would say yes. But there's also the time factor. When can you take the time? There'll be continuity calls for all the changes that are going in. If you want to change something for your own aesthetic reasons, you've got to be conscientious of the time it's going to take to rehearse it and do the music preparation and that sort of thing. How do you handle that, Larry? I don't think we've ever actually
well,
talked about this.
I remember one time on the producers when I was helping you out with some stuff, and I wrote something which was praised, and everybody said, "Oh, that's great," and I uh, turned around and said, "I can do better." And I
Do you remember which
actually
song it
asked,
was?
"I do." It was Haben Sie gehört, uh,
Uh-huh.
and everybody said, "Oh, that's great," and I said to you and Stroh and Mel that I missed the boat, and they said, "Oh no, it's great," and I said, do you mind? I'm not going to charge for it or anything. Let me just fix it. And I did. I
That's
fixed it
great.
overnight, and the
Yeah,
next day everybody agreed. And it was just 16 bars, but I had done it so it sounded like vaudeville, and I wanted it to sound more like. I'll tell you exactly what it is. I said I wanted it to sound like Jack Cassidy, and Mel said, "No, you mean Al Jolson." And I said, no, Jack Cassidy. I wanted to sound, more like 50s Broadway than 30s Broadway, and I fixed it right away. and you remembered, and that was all it was. But I said it's not going to cost you anything, and
Right.
that
Right.
type of thing. And you
Well,
did the
so
same
so
thing
that would
on the
have been
show where
probably
you'd
right
hear
after the
something.
sits probe. Yeah.
Exactly. It was the next day,
Yeah.
and
I
it was
mean,
fixed.
sometimes you can
And
you can fix it very quickly in the yeah. So, so that would have been right after the sits probe, probably before the band moved from the rehearsal space into the pit. So there's usually a day or two in there. So you wrote
yes,
it, new parts got on the stands, and the next time they played it, it was the new orchestration. Yeah, or the revised
right. And there was
orchestration.
no fuss.
Yeah,
They didn't even
sometimes
have to
in
rehearse it.
rehearsals
They just
you'll
played it.
hear something and you can change it in the band call. Once the band gets into the pit, it's harder, right? There's just less time and it's harder to get those changes in. So the best time to do it is when the band is in the rehearsal room or shortly thereafter.
And as you know, of course, the best it ever sounds is at the Zitz Pro because you can hear everything as you wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, yes, unfortunately, and that's just the nature of live theater. So we're all in the room together, and so you're hearing everything acoustically generally. I mean, there's usually a sound system in there to help the singers. Oh, this is a whole other conversation, but
Yeah,
without getting too
that's
deep into opinions about right, there's a the sits probe is the time when the cast and creatives hear the orchestra and the new orchestrations for the first time. Now it's interesting because sits probe was a very much inside baseball term when I first started in theater and back in the I think it was before electricity. But it was a very inside baseball term. It was I don't think I heard the word sits probe until I started doing new musicals and this word, oh, that's when we're going to hear the orchestrations for the first time. Now people use the word sits probe to mean any, like if you're doing South Pacific and you play the original orchestrations and the cast and the orchestra get together for the first time, that's a sits probe. Now that is a sits probe, so I'm not saying it's an incorrect usage, but it's anyway, I don't know why I'm bringing this up. Sits
it
probe.
was
So
the
yes,
orchestra reading with
it's
the cast
but
is what it
on a
always
new
was.
musical. So here's my point. Yeah, on a new musical, there's the added layer to this of it's the first time anyone is hearing these orchestrations outside of the very inner circle of the music team. Everyone's heard the South Pacific orchestrations before. You know what they're going to sound like. So my point is, and I'm sure most creative teams that I've worked with would agree, it's a time to hear it's the first time you're going to hear the orchestrations. They need to be able to have their first reaction to them, and it's usually pretty good. But then it'll settle in, and again, like I said, the choreographer might hear something missing or not quite what they imagined, or that accent that used to be on 3 is now on 1 in the next measure. We got to move it. Whatever little things like that. And it's a chance for the cast to hear the orchestrations for the first time because they're going to have to sing to it, and they're used to singing to piano and maybe drums in a rehearsal room. And so I always felt, and many music directors agree with me, and I agree with them, that that's the focus of the day, is making sure the cast can hear the orchestra, and to a certain extent the orchestra hear the cast, and the creative team can hear the orchestra. And sometimes you get into a room where it becomes like a concert, where there's a million guests, there's cameras, and it's like we're doing a concert of the orchestration for the first time, and the focus gets off of that work that I just described and more on the kind of spectacle of having the orchestra in the room and how that's good for publicity and social media and that sort of thing. I think there's a fine line there, and it's important to be cognizant in those situations of what that day is about. It's an expensive day and it's an important day, and like you said, it's the time. The orchestrations usually sound the best in that room, and it'll take a minute before it starts to approximate that in the theater. The sound department then needs to do their work, so it is a very important day.
Part of the problem is these days, because of our using digital programs like Finale and Sibelius and all that, they can actually hear a demo of the orchestrations ahead of time. Not the cast, I mean the powers that be and the composer. You can actually play something for them so they know what you've done. And there was a time when the first time everybody heard the orchestration was at the orchestra read or the Zitz probe as it's now called. So it's a whole different thing. Usually, in my experience, by the time we get to the Zitz probe, the the composer hopefully trusts you enough that they know that you haven't done anything egregious that they're gonna get
Right.
upset about.
I've almost never been asked to do finale playbacks. I mean, a handful of times, less than 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that to be more common, that people want to hear a little finale or Sibelius playback of your work?
Well, it depends. Usually, if it's someone if you're working with Steve Flaherty or or Alan Menken or somebody who knows you, he's not going to ask for anything because they know you're going to turn out. It's usually the more inexperienced people, or as you know, sometimes on a film, of course, they expect
A
something.
film is totally different. Yeah, we can get into that too if you. But yeah, that's the film world is. I was yeah speaking more about theater. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Certainly, you can. I mean, people could listen to a horrible sounding
And but
finale play.
then,
I mean,
but
I like to assign instruments to my staves so that at least there's a terrible trumpet sound being played. But some people don't. I think I don't want to speak for him, but I remember that Michael Starobin, at least in some of his finale scores, it's all a piano sound. He doesn't, at least he didn't back in the day.
deliberately,
Maybe he does more now, but
no, that's deliberately.
yeah,
He would do that so that
possibly
they can't
deliberately, yeah,
prejudge
maybe,
it.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
that's true.
yeah. So there you go. Yeah, he wanted people to really hear the orchestration with live musicians for the first time. And it makes a huge difference, of course.
Oh, it does. And here, I'm going to ask a question because this only happened to me once when I was conducting a lot of shows. Of course, the orchestra read was the most exciting time. Everybody's hearing it for the first time. Almost every show I've done, the Zitz probe was successful. But there was one show, and I won't mention what it was because I don't want to cast any aspersions on the orchestrator, where we did the Zitz probe, and it was a disaster. And the reason it was a disaster is because the score was not exactly first rate, and the orchestrations missed the boat. And I was sitting there, the orchestra, just I wanted to cry because I knew before I got there what was going to happen. And we ended up rewriting huge portions of it, which didn't make any difference. The show was still a disaster because the orchestrations very rarely pull it out of the hat. But have you had any times at an orchestra rehearsal where it didn't, not because of your work, but it didn't go as well as you thought it might have?
That's a good question. If I have, I've blocked it out of my memory. So maybe somebody listening to us will. I remember that one time that wasn't good at all. I would say there certainly have been times where a composer has said to me, "Oh, that section isn't what I thought it would be," but usually it's something very small. I mean, this gets into what I think what makes orchestrators who over time who have become more go-to players in the industry. Why are they asked to come back and do another show and another show and another show? Well, over time, one of the things you develop as an orchestrator is an instinct for reading between the lines, because nobody is going to speak music as well as the music department. But a lot of times you're dealing with other departments. You're dealing with a director, and even sometimes a composer and or lyricist who aren't, they're talented writers, but they're not trained musicians in the sense that they can talk about references and orchestration textures and that sort of thing. So you've got to interpret the information you're being given, and there's a lot of material that you have to wade through. Sometimes it's subtle things in the piano vocal. Sometimes it's something that a composer or a director or a choreographer says to you, an adjective they use, whatever it is. So I think over the years, and I think I probably started with some of this ability and then it's been developed over the years. But I've come to be able to do that interpretation job fairly well. So it's rare that I will completely miss something. But sometimes things just don't get communicated, or a composer doesn't know what they want until they hear what they don't want. So yes, there's certainly been, I wouldn't say a wholesale we have to throw this out and start over again, but there's a section of something, a bridge, an ending, something. So yes, of course. Although I'm going to just digress for a second. We've really digressed from the whole Seussical conversation, but we'll get back to that.
Yeah,
But I'm going
that's
to
okay.
digress for a second to talk about one particular sitz probe I'll go ahead and name names because I have so much respect for this director. Just think he's marvelous. But I was working with Sam Mendes on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and he he was he actually really cared about what the orchestrations were going to sound like. He had a very specific production design. This was in London. The show changed a lot when it came to the US, but very specific ideas about how the show looked, and he wanted the show to sound how it looked. And we did like, so here's an example actually of what you're asking. So we did a pre-orchestration workshop where I orchestrated a couple of numbers based on just his sort of description of what he wanted and what Mark Shaman and I thought the orchestration should be. And this was before the show ever went into rehearsals. And maybe Sam and I had one or two little conversations. So we do 3 songs or something like that. And we're actually in a recording studio in London. We were in Angel Studios and not recording anything, but just rehearsing there. And Sam comes in and he listens to all of it. And he just dressed me down. This is exactly what I was hoping it wouldn't be. You have to do more of this and more of that. And I remember Mark Shaman and I going like, really, we really liked what we did. Okay, but it was great that he did that because it impressed upon me in a really big way the subtle differences between what I had done and what he was looking for. And so then when I reorchestrated those numbers and the rest of the show, I really had a sense of I had Sam looking over my shoulder in my mind, right, the whole time. So now I really sweated over that for the months that it took me to orchestrate the show. So now we get to the sits probe, and Sam, he has his head in his hands the whole time. I'm thinking, that's it. I'm ready for another dressing down, and you know, clearly this isn't going well. So the sits probe ends, and it was very successful. Everybody enjoyed it, and Sam says, "Okay, can we all now go into another room and talk about what we've just heard?" So we go into another room, and then Sam said something extremely complimentary to me, which I won't repeat word for word what he said, but it was very complimentary. For whatever reason, his hands were in his head. It had nothing to do with the orchestrations. But and then he gave me 3 or 4 little things that he wanted differently. One of which was kind of a redo of a number, but it was going back to a version we had done in a demo for that number that we had intentionally thought
Yeah.
needed to be changed for the production, and he preferred the demo version. So we even had it and just went back. I think I had even maybe orchestrated it, and we just went back and replaced what we had with the earlier thing with some changes. So there were some small changes, but so that's and that was a really good way to do it because Sam could only impart so much information verbally, but when he heard my first attempt at these things, then he could get very specific about what he wanted differently. And so that was, and it was very successful. I mean, he was extremely happy with the orchestrations, and I was happy that he was happy. He was my boss.
I've told the story, and you've probably heard it before, about our dear friend Ralph Burns. Uh, I
Yes.
was conducting there, playing our song, and it was a big break for me. It was Marvin Hamlish, who was, at that time the hottest guy in town, and I was the music director of the show. And we were working on a number, and Marvin was always the muscle in the music department, and he turned around and said, "Take this out, take that out, take this out, take that out." And Ralph turned to me on the podium and said, "He's fucking with my masterpiece."
Yes. Which he said ironically, I assume, right?
Yes,
Or was it ironic?
he was trying to be funny,
Yes.
and he was just saying. And
Yes. Yes.
on
Yes.
another note, there was another number where Marvin wasn't happy, not with Ralph's work, but with a particular number, and he said, "Ralph, can you write a new orchestration on this and just give me a different approach?" And it wasn't being critical of Ralph; he just didn't like the way it was turning out. And the next day, Ralph came in with a new orchestration for the number that was entirely different. And that's the orchestration that remained on the number for all time. And it was a totally different orchestration. It came totally from Ralph. So it was not an insult to Ralph. He just wanted something different. And I think that's what you're kind of
I would
saying,
find that
like,
really hard to do. I mean, can you
of
imagine?
course, of course. And
Yeah.
Ralph told a story on Golden Boy where he kept on being asked to redo Sammy Davis's first number. So he did it like 6 times, and then he finally uh, farmed it out to Larry Wilcox. But he gave Larry his original sketch, and Elliot Lawrence was conducting the orchestra and turned to Ralph, hearing Larry Wilcox's chart, said, "Why did you write the same arrangement again?" Because Larry was working from the same sketch. Finally, Jim Tyler did the chart, and that was the one they used. But that's how it happens sometimes. But that's great what you were saying about Sam Mendes. That's really fascinating, and it's not digressing from Seussical. I'm glad we're covering more and more material and different composers, and uh, I think the whole thing that's happened in England because of Cameron Mackintosh is they had these pre-orchestration meetings, and they actually uh, were demoing orchestrations. He was doing that with all the shows that he did with Bill Brown, and uh, I had told this somewhere else, but when they were doing Half a Sixpence, Bill was very ill, and he eventually died shortly thereafter. But I was asked to sit in at the audition for Half a Sixpence, and I was sitting next to Bill the whole time, and Stiles and Drew were there, and the music department, Steve Brooker, and everybody from Cameron's staff was there. And I was sitting there, and Cameron would say, "Well, Larry, what do you think?" And I said, "I think it's all great," because I wasn't going to say a
Yes.
word. But it was a great job because I got paid for every day I was there without ever once expressing my opinion.
That's great. Well, Bill was such an amazing writer that,
Yeah.
it's just to get to sit in front of an orchestra and look at Bill scores and hear the orchestra play. That's, I'd pay them. Well, maybe not pay them, but no, yes, I would pay them. For that opportunity. And Mark Cumberland and I did have the opportunity to really dig into Bill's scores on the revival of Crazy for You, where we were asked to reduce his work, and it just was it was so much fun. I've stolen a
Oh,
lot
sure.
of things from
It,
Bill's
it's great
toolkit
to dig into
after
to
that show.
other people's scores. Yeah, sure.
Yes,
But
yeah,
but I got to
Mark was
sit
just
there with Bill, and I had known Bill for years anyway. I knew him when he was a bass player years ago, so it was just fun to
ah,
sit there, and
wow.
I was very happy to be able to hang out. So it was my idea of a perfect job, no responsibility at all.
Those are fun days. Yeah. It's funny you were talking about
So
Ralph, and that sort of that great comment that he made about my masterpiece. So I remember once on Fosse, sitting in a rehearsal with Ralph, and Ralph was at that. This was 1998, so at that point in time, he was just venerated. Everybody was so respectful of him, and he was deserving of that respect. But he was one of the guys. I mean, he was extremely comfortable being in that position and didn't need deference particularly. But of course, everybody was very deferential. And Gordon Harrell was the music supervisor and turned to him at one point and said, "Ralph, I'm so sorry to ask this, but would you mind if we maybe took whatever it was, we put that clarinet line down an octave or whatever it was in that moment." And Ralph turned to him and said, "Gordon, just make it good." Which I just thought that was great. It was such the right answer. Gordon, just make it good. He didn't mind whatever. Gordon was a great musician, is a great musician. Um, and Ralph trusted him. He knew if Gordon was asking for something, then that it was necessary. And had he had another solution, I'm sure he would have recommended it. And that's another thing is sometimes you'll write something and somebody will make a suggestion for a change. Oh, can we get rid of that beat four in that measure or whatever? And you just say yes. I mean, unless you had a really compelling reason, this isn't your baby only. There's a lot of minds in the music department, and yeah, we have to be very, very flexible and not precious about our work.
I must tell another story because you've triggered me. Uh, I was doing a show called Copperfield with Irwin Kostal as the orchestrator, and Irv, like Ralph, was venerated because of Mary Poppins and West Side Story and Sound of Music. And we were at the orchestrating for Copperfield, and we played an arrangement. And Al Kasha, who was the co-writer with Joel Hirschhorn, said to Irv in front of the whole orchestra, "Irwin, that is the worst arrangement you have ever written." And which was horrifying. Irv was, this giant in the music business, and he was on the back end of his career. And Irv just smiled and said, Al, tell me what it is that you don't like. And Al Cash turned around and said, well, when the character says the men would go to war, the trumpets need to go ta 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 ta, you know. So Irv said to me, what bar is that? And I called out the bar, and he dictated the notes to the trumpet section. It's just ta 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 for the two trumpets and a trombone. And he said, can we play the arrangement again? So we went back to the top of the arrangement, played the whole thing all over again with that one change. And Al Kasha turned and said, Irwin, that is the finest arrangement you have ever written. And at which point, Irv looked at me on the podium and winked. And it was one of the greatest lessons I ever learned. It's what you're saying. There are all these people, and that was it.
There is so much to unpack in that story, and all of it's amazing. But the thing that really struck me was that Irv didn't rattle him to hear that kind of criticism. He stayed completely calm and asked a follow-up question, got the answer, made the change, and everything turned out well. My question is, was ta 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 in the piano vocal sketch? Because I'm guessing it wasn't, because had it been there, he would have put it in the trumpets. So right, this was probably an idea that the composer had on the spur of the moment, that he was imagining someone else would know what was in his head.
Just
Sometimes
at
you
the
don't.
moment, it was just one of those things. And because most of the score was in lead sheet form anyway, there was very little
There you go.
that
Yeah.
was. So as you said, everyone has an idea, and everyone has to be included, and you have to listen to it. So
It's interesting when you talk about a score in lead sheet form, that, because I always think about Robert Russell Bennett being asked to arrange the shows that he worked on prior to orchestrating them. I mean, am I getting that right? That he would that was part of hiring Robert Russell Bennett, is he would kind of write the piano rehearsal part, and that does make things easier. There have been a couple of shows where I've written or been involved in writing the piano arrangements before rehearsals, often because it's a takedown or a MIDI takedown or something like that. I don't do much of that anymore, and that's a whole other conversation about who does these takedowns and what exactly are they doing when they do the takedowns. Is it arranging? Is it transcribing? But in the cases that I'm thinking of, it was a transcription and then further arranging of the parts, and it does make it much easier to orchestrate if you're thinking about what the piano part is as an orchestrator. You'll tend to to arrange with the orchestrations in mind.
I don't know. Have you seen any of Phil Lang's scores, or maybe not in a while? Uh,
Uh,
be,
I Unless it's something that you've showed me, I probably haven't.
okay, Phil used to put in the piano conductor part before he orchestrated. He wrote out a full piano conductor sketch and orchestrated that. Now, some of it probably was
And
done by the
had he
dance
been given a
arranger.
piano part? Right,
Sometimes,
got it. Right,
but more often than not, he
right.
actually put it on his score. And I have somewhere in my collections the Camelot scores, and the full thing is there, and it's not done by a copyist. It was done by Phil, and then he scored it out. How, in other words, he might have been given an arrangement, but whatever he wasn't given, he still did it and finished the arrangement. And I think
Right.
in days gone by, before we had dance arrangers who actually did more than just dance numbers, uh, there was a lot of arranging involved. A lot of the orchestrator was indeed the arranger, and sometimes would just be given a tune.
Yes.
So, and
Yeah,
of
we've
course,
talked
we
about
still
that a
have to
lot,
do
you and
that.
I. Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and
yeah. And
no, I was going to say sometimes we get something from a dance arranger, and sometimes they haven't fully realized it, or uh, depending on the dance arranger, the skill set wasn't so much into arranging except routining, and we've had to finish it and fill it out so that it works for the orchestra. So it's not just a
right,
piano part.
right. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's certainly, that is why we're hired, is to do that, to be able to interpret a piano part. And traditionally that was how orchestration was taught. You would oftentimes take a famous piano piece, that sort of thing, and have to orchestrate it. And there's techniques for looking at a piano is 10 fingers on a keyboard, and orchestra is completely different. There's not only are you talking about instruments that only play one note at a time, but they have different densities and in combinations they sound. So there's a lot of technique involved in transferring or orchestrating a piano part, transmuting it to an orchestra. And so I certainly over the years have come to expect less that the dance arrangers will imagine that transformation. Although sometimes it is very helpful if they know they want a trumpet solo and they've written a melody for the trumpet, that they just say it's a trumpet. I would far prefer to have that information, because in those moments I'm there to please them. I want to make sure that their work is realized. And in fact, just thinking back to a show I did 6 or 8 months ago, Boop, Daryl Waters had written this really wonderful incidental music, which everyone will get to hear next spring. And I orchestrated it. And at one point he said, "Oh, I'm not sure about flutes there. Is there any other way to do it?" And I said, and Daryl's a great orchestrator. He was being so respectful. I said, "Daryl, what did you imagine when you wrote it?" He said, "Clarinets." I said, "I'll make it for clarinets." I just changed it. He was being so respectful, but he had an idea in mind, and I had done something else, and so we were able to arrive very quickly at what he wanted. But most dance arrangers aren't going to be thinking about their piano material that way. And
Costel said at one point that some dance arranger gave him these massive chords, and he went to the dance arranger and said, "I have three trumpets and two trombones. Pick your best five notes." And he said
Yes,
something. And also, I remember years ago working with a dance arranger who's long gone, named Al Mello, who was L.A. based. He did a few Broadway shows, but there used to be a show called the Share Show out here for the charity Share, not Share as in Sonny and Cher. And Al would do the dance numbers, and he would write piano parts. He didn't think orchestra at all. He would write melody, harmony, chord symbols with a bass line, and he left it totally to the orchestrator. And in some ways, that was delightful because we just did what we did. And then there are, of course, other guys who know exactly what they're writing. Uh, we both worked with David Chase a lot, and David, when he hands you a part, it's very clear that he means that to be the brass section, or that means to be the
yes.
reeds. He
And
knows
what
what he has in mind.
he's a very good orchestrator, and I think that's part of it. Is he has experience orchestrating his own stuff and other people's music, and so I think there is a lot of thought behind those piano arrangements that he writes. And he and I work together a lot, as you have with him, and he'll often communicate to me. He'll say to me, if anything isn't obvious what it's supposed to be, ask. And if I ask, he always says, "Oh yeah, that's a string line." And often they'll
Yeah,
say, "But don't feel like you have to use it." And almost always I use it, or some small variation thereof. But I find it helpful. I'm not I don't need to invent every string line.
yeah,
If somebody has an idea that I feel is, as, let's just say it, as good as something I would have thought of, or equivalent. There are times I've been I've been given string lines that I haven't thought I can probably do something that's in the spirit of that, but I can make it a little better. Maybe we don't want to track the melody exactly, for 16 bars or whatever it is, that I might,
sure,
or I've created, or I want the string line to come in the spaces of the vocal, not where the vocal. It's little things. So, but
right.
more often than not, when somebody makes a suggestion or request, well, just do it.
My favorite is Jerry Herman, who said, "Do whatever you want, just don't change my melody, my harmony, my chords, or anything else I've written down."
Yes, do whatever you want. Right, exactly.
But he was joking, so it was good. I like that. But more often than not, and I'm sure you'll vouch for this, most of the time, the composers and everybody else are very appreciative of whatever you bring to the to the dinner.
Oh, I've definitely found that. I've definitely found that the ones who are really great trained musicians. Like, we're to bring the conversation back around to Seussical and Steve Flaherty. So Steve writes every note of his piano part, and he writes every note of the vocal arrangements and generally speaking, every dance arrangement on shows. But if it's a big dance show like Seussical was, in fact, that was David Chase. So David was tasked with dance arrangements. But Steve's an excellent musician, obviously, and so will tend not to change as much. If there's a texture there, I really try to honor it. And what's interesting to me is to look at shows that Bill of Steve's that Bill Brown orchestrated, and then to think about my own shows and to think about how Bill transformed the piano parts versus how I did. And I've learned a lot from thinking, having those kinds of thoughts and analyzing things. But generally speaking, it's all there, and that's very helpful for an orchestrator because, again, we're there to obviously make it sound good, as Ralph Burns said, but to honor the composer's intentions. Now, what if you have a composer who isn't musically literate in that way? They might have ideas about what they want, but they don't really know in musical terms how to communicate that. Then it's very helpful if they say, I'm thinking of a show that I did recently where the material is, I'm not going to call it a pastiche, but there's a lot of things that are inspired by different types of songs and eras and that sort of thing. So they would play me something, or they'd say, this is like this kind of a song or that kind of a song. Hugely helpful. And then I know how to both arrange the material and orchestrate it. But now let's talk about something else for a second that I really have wanted to touch on, because I think it's important, particularly if there are younger music department folks listening to this. It's just something to think about and to have conversation about, which is arranging a show. So let's take the case of a composer, lyricist, maybe a team or maybe an individual who isn't particularly musically literate, and maybe they've written everything in Logic, let's say, and so now the music has to be transcribed. And there's a transcription made, which very often nowadays is done by a music assistant, who is vitally important on a show, but tends to be a less experienced member of the team. Although now there's now a job called music assistant, which is not an intern. Now there are people who have elevated that job to something with a very deep skill set from having those experiences on other shows. So this language is not completely accurate, but somebody who's oftentimes it's in a workshop setting, who's not paid very much, is transcribing this material, and then it goes from there. But my question is, how much does it go from there? How much thought is put into these arrangements? Is somebody writing down the changes that are made in rehearsal? Is somebody thinking about textures? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And where it gets into an area that I think we need to talk about is when folks have taken an arranger credit. If you call yourself an arranger on a show, you should be arranging. You should be very specifically putting ideas, accompaniment ideas on the page. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes I get an arrangement that is essentially a written out chord chart. So what I would play on piano if I was reading from chords, that written out. Well, that tells me what the piano part is, but it doesn't tell me very much else about what the arrangement needs to be, right? You know what I'm saying, Larry, right?
I know.
So
Yeah.
I think we have to think about, first of all, possibly educating folks that are coming into this business about what arranging really is, and secondly, to just sort of say it out loud that if you take a title, you've got to do that job, and what does doing that job look like? And maybe that's where a little more education comes into it. So anyway, I would love to know your thoughts on this.
Well, we've both been there, and I think now with a little bit age and experience, we just go ahead and do it. We do what we know, what we think is correct, in helping them realize their dream. Uh, and more often than not, we succeed. Uh, but I feel the same way because very often they'll give you a sketch, and all it is a piano part. It's not a sketch at all. it's just a notated piano part. And very often their harmonic um, vocabulary may not be as extensive as it should be, or uh, as uh, uh, evolved as our experiences. And it's
Sure.
that's where your judgment and how you handle it's people skills at that point. It goes beyond musical skills, as you know, and it's dancing on a very fine line of where we go forward. And I learned a lot from,
Yeah.
as you have, but from watching people like Ralph and Costal, who would just step out and do, but they were already giants in their. Matter of fact, when we met them, they were our age now. When we were,
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Oh
20
boy.
20 years old, and they already
I can't
knew.
even think
So
about that.
yeah, so it's very interesting how they put up with us, but but
Right.
I hope
Well,
I
I'm gonna just to expand on what you yeah, just to expand on what you said. Sorry, I know we're talking on top of each other. It's because of the gap
yeah.
in our transmission here. But to just to expand on that, so I imagine, and this was true when I first started out. The music department was a little different. There was a musical director, there was a dance arranger, and there was an assistant music director. There were rehearsal pianists, and there was a composer, and everybody would kind of pitch in terms of the arrangements as needed. Maybe sometimes even a pianist in rehearsal. Oh, we need an ending on that piece. Can you just give us something? And then that would become the ending. We need four more bars, and that would eventually evolve into the ending. And the rehearsal pianist probably was never credited for it, but there wasn't anybody that had this. I'm making air quotes now. This arranging credit, whose one brain was supposed to be overseeing all of these arrangements. And then that has evolved into now we have music supervisors, and that means different things on different shows depending on the circumstances. We have arrangers. Oftentimes now, dance arrangers are tasked with writing incidental music and writing arrangements for the shows and that sort of thing. But I think there's a kind of an impulse to take the arranging credit and say, well, I figured out what this piano part is, or and and yet you and I and other orchestrators are still being tasked with a lot of arranging, and we're not taking an arranging credit. We're accredited as the orchestrator. Now, everybody who has been in this business for a while knows that orchestration involves a lot of arranging. And all I'm saying is, in essence, we're now naming this job of arranging, and I'm going to get myself into so much trouble here. But what I'm saying is, in my world, I've always taken very seriously the titles that I've been given. If I'm an arranger, I arrange. That means what's on that page is orchestratable. I've demonstrated what all the textures are. And I think that it's, I'm not going to call it a lost art, but I'm going to say that maybe folks that are accepting these titles or going after these titles don't have all the information that they might need to have about what an arrangement looks like. So maybe there's an opportunity here for some education. Um, I think there's a lot, because I'm now going to speak from the other side. I think a lot of these folks would like to be creative in that way. They just may not know what that looks like on the page. And so maybe there's something there. Anyway, I
Well,
guess I'm talking about a pet peeve. You could call it a pet peeve. I'm an old guy. I'm cranky. Um, but I would love for there to be a way to convey this information. Maybe that's something that we can do as a community. Look for ways
I agree with you, and I've
teaching
and you
that.
know
Yeah.
that I've tried to teach that, in some of the ASMAC things and all the things we talk about. But you just made me think of a show I did where I was hired as the orchestrator, and the conductor in London was a well established arranger conductor. He gave me for this particular show a full score for the entire show, cover to cover, and I will tell you that 98% of it was boom chick piano parts. There were no fills,
Yes.
nothing. And he said, I've
Yes.
arranged it, go ahead and orchestrate it. And I was screwed because there was nothing in there. And I even came to a rehearsal as we're experienced arrangers, but, and we were both conductors. And I, started out conducting a lot of shows. I went in and said, have you thought about on the 14th chorus of this song, maybe going up a semitone? You know, and he said, absolutely not. We want it in the same key all the way. And I was stuck, and he had absolutely no fills. Now I went ahead and filled it up. At that point, I knew I was dealing with someone with a limited skill set, and I just went ahead and did it. And there were no objections, to anything I did, but it was a very,
Yeah, some
very
of what, yes.
difficult job. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say some of what we do is protecting people from themselves. That doesn't happen that often, where somebody comes to you in a really strong way with an idea that you know is not going to fly. But sometimes, and we, as an orchestrator, you do have discretion over keys. I mean, I remember not that long ago, I changed the key of a dance section in something. I loved the dance arrangement. I just felt that how it got in and out of the vocal, I had a different idea. I thought mine was better, so I went ahead and did it. Nobody, I think, even noticed. And I think the only time that I would chuckle to myself is when they would go back to the rehearsal part in tech. They were playing the old keys, and nobody even noticed that I made a new key in the orchestration. But that's part of what we do is making those kind of changes. But it sounds like in this situation, you were really dealing with somebody that had a lot of pride in the work that they had done, but kind of needed to be protected from themselves a little bit, which is what you did.
And sometimes, if you have some young kid who really wants to learn, you kind of take them under and say, have you thought of this, and stuff like that, and help them along a little bit when you can. I've always tried to do that, having come from the podium. If there was someone young on the podium, especially now where most of the people who get to the podium have never even conducted an orchestra. They've led a band from a keyboard, and all of a sudden they got a bunch
Right.
of musicians in front of them, and they're a little clueless that way. So it's a complicated job, and that's why you can count all the orchestrators on in theater on one and a half hands. It's not like there are many people doing it.
Right. It is a complicated job, and it's very time consuming, and it's the time pressure is really great, as we all know. We've talked about this, but I've always found it very satisfying. I like being the person or a person that helps to bring someone's vision to the world. And I've always loved working with an orchestra. I am a composer sometimes, but I have great respect for the composers that I work for, and I want their music to sound good. That's always been very appealing to me, and I enjoy that part of it. I like seeing the smiles in the theater when it all comes together, and having the pat on the back. Wow, this is even better than I imagined it can be. I think that to an orchestrator is better than any award. Is that moment where the composer says to you, "This is exactly what I wanted. This is more than I could have hoped for." Then I feel like that's when I've done my job, and I've done it. You know,
We could do this for another hour, and I think
we
uh,
could.
we should actually plan and do another podcast if you're willing, because I think there's a lot to be said here, and
Yeah,
I'm perfectly
absolutely.
happy to share the time with you and hear you talk about it. So I will pin you down for another one very quickly. But what you're saying is very valuable, and we're talking about things in a different way than we would have talked about it 10 years ago.
Yeah, probably. Yep, that's probably true. You do get to a certain point in your career where you start thinking about what's going to happen after you. You know what I mean? And we were lucky enough to work with some really, really amazing musicians who taught us so much. And yeah, I think more about that now, about my perspective on things, and maybe that is valuable for people coming up. It's valuable for them to hear about. So yeah, I would love to
I got to tell
get
you
more
this,
into any of
Phil.
these
You'll
topics.
you'll appreciate it. When I did playing our song. I was 27 years old, and Ralph was the orchestrator, and he was, he was quite famous in our world. And Ralph was 58. I remember this, and I remember walking with him out to lunch or something like that, and he said, "Larry," he said, "if you want to stay in the business, when you get to be my age, hang out with 27-year-olds." and and he said to me,
That's
because
right.
that's the way you'll
That's
stay in
right.
the, that's the way you'll stay in the business forever. And he was very mentoring to you and to me and to Danny Trube and to Gordon Harrell, who, and people like that. He was always very inclusive and was willing to share, and really
Yes. Very
uh,
true.
didn't hesitate
Very true.
to tell us exactly what he was thinking, and to show you how to do it.
Oh, very true.
So
Right.
I think back to that, and also I'll never forget sitting with Phil Lang, and I was the pianist on a tour of applause, and he came into Scranton, Pennsylvania to watch the rehearsal, and he said to me, "You want to be an orchestrator? So the first thing you do is read the lyric." He said, "That will inform you to everything," and
Yes.
I've never forgotten that. And he was one of those really supportive guys. And if someone said to him, "I want a rim shot on, on beat three," he would say, "Yeah, of course." Never balked at anything.
Right. Well, there's no profit in balking, really. I mean, if you think about what we're there to do, if you really disagree with something, find a way to do it better. But the thing you're asked to do is you've got to figure out a way to do it. And saying yes is one, or thinking about a way to improve on that idea as a way of saying yes is another way of thinking about it. But yeah, we're in a service job. That's what we do. The only thing I wanted to say was you've mentioned this to me several times just in thinking about careers and ages, that so many of our idols did their most famous work when they were in their mid 30s. And now, of course, we're older than that. And our younger colleagues who are in their mid 30s are doing work that they're becoming very well known for. So, but of course, you have a career after your 30s too. So what you do with that career obviously is, very, is all about the longevity, having longevity in the business. But yes, hanging out with younger people is certainly a way to feel connected to the folks who are coming up with fresh ideas and a lot of energy and inspiration and that sort of thing. And I'm fairly certain that's what Ralph was talking about.
It was, and I'm so glad we did this. I'm going to say I really thank you for doing this. It's good to reminisce about the future, and I think that it's a terrific thing. I'm really grateful for you doing this with me, and we're going to do it again. And that's not a threat; it's a promise.
Fantastic.